Good afternoon, everyone. First, thank you, everyone, for being here, and welcome to the Center for European Studies. So my name is Sebastián Royo. I'm a professor at Clark University in Worcester, and I'm also an affiliate here at the Center for European Studies. And it's my absolute great pleasure today to host this event and to welcome Thomas Klein Bockhoff. I'm going to introduce him briefly. He's going to give his remarks. He will not have a PowerPoint presentation. And then we will open at the end for questions, comments from the audience. Thomas has been appointed director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, starting in last August. Most recently, he served as the Guido Goldmann Distinguished Scholar for Geostrategy at the German Marshall Fund in Berlin, which he led for 5 years. With an earlier tenure at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C., he served on the organization executive team for a decade. Between 2013 and 2017, Thomas served as an advisor to German President Joachim Gauck, overseeing policy planning and speed writing. And he started his career as a journalist with Die Zeit, Germany Intellectual Weekly, and became its Washington bureau chief. He is a longtime expert on transatlantic, foreign, and security policy, and he works on several aspects of the emerging global order. He's the author of the book, The World Needs the West, A Fresh Start for a Liberal Order, which he published in 2019, and the co-author of a study, Designing Ukraine's Recovery in the Spirit of the Marshall Plan, which he published in 2022. The title of his presentation today will be very relevant to the moment that we're living. New president, all continent. What the US election mean for Europe. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Thomas. I want to remind everyone that this event is being recorded. So please remember that whatever you do or say will be recorded for posterity. So, Thomas.
So, thank you very much, Professor Hoyer, for this kind introduction. And thank you to the Center for European Studies. I've been here 24 years ago, back now. Great pleasure to be here. Pleasure to see familiar faces. Thank you for coming. And I do want to mention a few names with Dan Ziblatt and Elaine Papoulias, without whom I probably wouldn't be here. And I want to recognize Professor Karl Kaiser, who's been a guiding light to many of us in the transatlantic space for so long. Now, this talk was scheduled long before the election and needed to have a title anyway. And so it's a rather essayistic title. New president, old continent. There'd be nothing essayistic about what I will have to say. I'm sorry. It will rather be a bit of a hot wash because we're still 2 weeks in from this election and digesting. I will try to make a few simple points in hopes that they together make some sense. And please watch out for any predictions, because as you know, at least half of them will be incorrect. My first remark will be about the relevance of this election for the trajectory of transatlantic relations. The second point will be about the consequences for Ukraine. The third one about the European Union and its direction. and the fourth one about the country that I know best, which is Euro parlance for your own country, Germany, which has a relevant role to play in this situation. So when I left Berlin about 3 weeks ago, the foreign policy establishment, and especially the Foreign Office, had developed a narrative about what the election would mean and how one best would deal with their results. You could hear this narrative all over town, and it went something like this. Choppy waters ahead. In international affairs, and relations with the United States will be no exception. The United States will expect much more of its allies, of Europe, especially of Germany. This will be true for both candidates who agree on issues that are very relevant to allies, and those agreements are on defense, on Ukraine, on trade, and on China. On defense, both potential presidents will expect, so the narrative goes, more defense investment within NATO, more than the 2% of GDP that the vast majority of allies are either reaching or about to reach. On Ukraine, both candidates expect Europe to take on an even higher share of the costs of financing Ukraine during wartime. On trade, both candidates run on a protectionist agenda, whether on import taxes or something like the Inflation Reduction Act. And on China, both aspiring presidents expect more followership in America's quest to slow the ascent of China. None of these requests would be or could be met easily by Europe. None of them will find agreement across the old continent, and certainly not agreement within countries. So given these potential frictions with both potential presidents on the very same topics, relations with the United States would have to be managed carefully, and that means consequently it does not matter greatly whether Kamala Harris or Donald Trump moves into the White House. From a European perspective, the difference between is in tone and in style. And I repeat that because I've heard it several times, and it's a verbatim quote, in tone and in style. I've heard it so many times, in fact, that I asked myself whether this is some sort of collective self-suggestion. Is this what diplomats tell themselves in order to maintain a positive outlook? Is this a diplomatic need to maintain a neutral position in foreign elections? Or maybe the customary hypocrisy of international relations that we so clearly see in the blustery welcomes by foreign leaders of Donald Trump? Now, there are multiple problems with the narrative of equidistance of Europe vis-à-vis Trump and vis-à-vis Harris. In fact, I see a category error in the attempt to put Harris and Trump in the same box. Won't it make a difference to Europe if one candidate sees alliances as a burden to America, the other as a force multiplier? Won't it make a difference to Europe if one sees America's interest in Ukraine in ending the war as quickly as possible, whatever the conditions, while the other believes that beating back the aggressor is in America's best interest in order to reach a just and lasting peace? Won't it matter for the ability and willingness of allies to sign on to America's competition with China, whether one candidate sees the contest in hegemonic and the other in systemic terms? Even if some of Harris's and Trump's policy, when seen from Europe, might look similar at first, the goals, the definitions of the national interest, the underlying value systems are dramatically different. This, as we look forward into a Trump presidency, will show more as time passes. The gap between the continents will therefore widen over time, not close. And that is, in my view, the trajectory that this election has put us on. Just to give you one example of what I mean, France, Germany, Italy, and Poland signed a letter of intent at the most recent NATO summit to develop a new ground-launched cruise missile with a range of more than 500 kilometers in order to close a deterrence gap vis-à-vis Russia in conventional terms, with conventional means. It will take years before the four will be able to develop and deploy this missile. In the meantime, the US has committed to field its Tomahawk cruise missiles in Germany. That, to me, is ideal behavior within an alliance. The largest partner covers for the allies when and as long as they are on path to become more ready to defend themselves. And Europe will be more ready to defend itself. That process, however, may unfold in one of two ways. In a disruptive and even maybe antagonistic way, or alternatively governed by the principle of alliance maintenance and alliance solidarity. This, of course, is the difference between the two approaches of Trump and Biden-Harris. This is substantive difference, not tone. So let me ask again, does this not matter? So you might ask, why am I harking back on this past? Why don't we look forward into the Trump presidency? And that's because I would not like us to engage in all too easy rationalizations. In Europe, we tend to minimize the threat that is Trump because we have to get along with him. And we learned to do that during his first term. Yes, it is true, we have to get along with him, but we also should not kid ourselves about the magnitude of what's ahead. We will have to work with a president that will weaponize security dependency, who will have no qualms about blackmailing us in the process. We might well be in a trade war with the United States soon. If Trump chooses to level secondary sanctions on European entities for any reason, we will have no choice but to start using the new anti-coercion instrument that the European Union developed in Trump's first term. So from a European perspective, there is nothing to be taken lightly about the Trump presidency. Given Trump's re-election and the snapback to a nationalistic and isolationist outlook, the United States must now be seen as an unpredictable and, yes, unreliable power. There is nothing to be counted on long-term anymore. Anything can be reversed now, next week, or in 4 years. Everything can be expected, including the opposite. Now, how to plan and conduct foreign policy if this is your most important partner? Therefore, my first point is that, from my perspective, as a European, the Trump presidency will, at the minimum, greatly influence the stability of the transatlantic space, and it might well be an order influencing or an order changing event. The question is whether we talk about the global order or just about the Atlantic order and in its institutions, NATO and the European Union. My second point is about Ukraine. It may well be the case that the first victim of Trump's second term will be Ukraine. Most certainly, it was not a coincidence that Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, was among the first to congratulate Donald Trump on his electoral victory. Nobody has more to gain from a good relationship with Trump, given Trump's intention to end U.S. aid and force a peace on Ukraine that many in Ukraine fear is not to their liking and is not a just peace as they see it. If Trump attempts to strike a deal, it will likely be a deal solely with Vladimir Putin. At least that is what we can assume from what we know from his first term of how he operates. Gone the times when Western leaders told themselves nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And it's not just about Ukraine. Europe will likely not be at the table either. All of this against the backdrop that the outcome of this war will define the new European order for some time to come. But Ukraine cannot accept being shut out, and neither can Europe. So, what to do? The major European countries, Poland, Great Britain, France, Italy, Germany, could form a contact group with Ukraine to explore the conditions of a ceasefire and an eventual peace. And that is before Trump even assumes office. Preempting Trump will better enable the European group to cooperate with Trump when the time comes. So, preempt to cooperate would be my unsolicited policy advice from this podium. In the meantime, Europe will also have to decide whether the continent is unified enough to replace the Trump-led United States as Ukraine's primary military backer. That would presumably include buying weapons from the United States, as has been suggested by people close to Donald Trump. For this to happen, the European Union has two tools in order to raise the required funds, and that is provided it has the political will. And it does not need a Hamiltonian moment of snap federalization to get this done. Tool number one would be the immobilized Russian state assets. The EU has just agreed on a 50 billion credit backed by the windfall profits of the immobilized central bank assets of Russia. But I have to tell you, it took nearly 3 years, nearly the whole period of the war, to negotiate this agreement, and it is the least aggressive version of using these assets without eating into the principle which Russia formally owns until reparations are determined. Of course, more aggressive versions of the usage of these funds are conceivable. Many in Europe, mostly led by the European Central Bank, have resisted confiscation so far for reasons of international law and of the stability of the euro. Europeans might be forced to strike a deal, however, that is a compromise that they wouldn't have considered early in the war as the stakes increase. Tool number two would be a next-gen EU fund, a version 2.0. That's a debt-financed instrument, and that is, as always, in debt in the European Union, a politically sensitive topic, especially since the results of the first such fund, first ever fund, meant for COVID relief, hasn't even been evaluated. Under certain conditions, this could pass muster even with the staunchest of the critics here, which would be the German Constitutional Court. Just yesterday, a more far-reaching proposal was circulated by a group of policy practitioners, including my own board chair at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and they suggest an expeditionary force by Britain, Canada, and a continental European coalition of the willing, air defense shield for Western Ukraine, security guarantees, and the list goes on. So therefore, given the magnitude of these choices, the question is about the political will to do this across the continent. And that, my prediction will be exceedingly hard to get to come by, even given the stakes. And that will be my third point, the European Union. Conventional wisdom holds that progress in European integration is always forged in crisis. Europe, or so the tale goes, will stick together when it must. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, I think last week, said that the response to America first must be Europe united. Yes, it must. I agree. But will it? The last time that Europe came together in a crisis, and the crisis led to more European integration, is in fact Russia's war on Ukraine. Europeans rallied to Ukraine's help, spent enormous amounts of aid for military and civilian purposes, more than even the United States, found instruments to do so within the European system, developed a new and useful division of labor between NATO and the EU. And today, for the first time, we have a defense commissioner in the EU. You might say European integration at work, forged in crisis. But let's also remember how that piece of progress came about. It all happened because the United States government, led by President Biden, spent a full half year prior to the Russian attack convincing Europeans of the imminent danger and forming the alliance. It was a role out of central casting for America. Its leadership brought Europe together and thus enabled the European Union to do its helpful work. It allowed Germany to move in America's slipstream as it went from offering 5,000 helmets to becoming the second largest military equipment supplier to Ukraine. And it allowed Poland and the other eastern flank states to take a more aggressive stance on Russia, knowing full well that America would have their back. But what now? Is Donald Trump going to be the same type of European pacifier? Is he going to embrace the role that all American post-World War II presidents embraced vis-à-vis Europe at some point in their tenure, to attempt to take geopolitical competition and mistrust out of Europe's political marketplace? Unfortunately, the opposite is more likely to happen, and we know from Trump's first term. Trump was more than happy to play European nations off against each other. He would exploit and exacerbate difference and seek advantage from weakness. During Trump 1.0, European nations, at least some of them, did not feel like allies, but like client states. Such behavior has been and will be jet fuel for European populists, right-wing as well as left-wing. They claim that their countries are now vassals of the United States and therefore need to, and I quote, take back control. As we meet here today, we can already see cracks opening up in Europe, differences emerging. Already, I can detect at least 3 different Europes as Trump's second term is about to begin: the accommodationists, the sovereignists, and the populists. The accommodationists will be led by Poland. They will accept Trump's attempt to bilateralize relationships with Europe. Most of the accommodationists reside close to Russia's border, and their attempt to oblige with Trump will be born out of the clear and present danger at their own borders. Their need to maintain Article 5 and the Common Defense Clause of the Washington Treaty of NATO is so overwhelming that they will want to please, charm, impress, distract Trump. By the way, I would count Germany into this camp. In fact, the dividing line in Europe between groups is the Rhine. And the reason for that is that east and north of the river, there is nuclear sharing based on American power. West of the river, there is the French force de frappe, which allows for a different assessment of one's own strategic situation. The sovereignists, of course, are led by France. They will not only want to strengthen Europe, and in that they agree with the accommodationists, but they want to go further. They want to distance Europe from America and establish it as an independent pole in what they see as a multipolar world. They believe unreliable America can no longer be counted on as a security anchor of Europe. The populists will be led by Hungary and Viktor Orban. With Trump's election, Orban believes his time of leadership in Europe has come. He has invested heavily in the MAGA movement, and the MAGA movement is courting him back. He believes a domino effect will be created by Trump's election in Europe, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, where institutional foundations of liberal democracy are not as old as in Western Europe, and party affiliation of citizens are not as strong. But be aware, this will not be a love fest between Orban and Trump. Populist Atlanticism will likely not replace old school Atlanticism. And that is because Viktor Orban himself views Trump more like a like-minded politician than as a partner in international affairs. In fact, Orban believes that Europe needs to emancipate itself from US influence, and he sees Poland as a Russophobic nation that is a Trojan horse for the US in Europe. So American conservatives may well have bet on the wrong horse here. In conclusion to this point, if Europe is to find the political will to defend Ukraine when Trump's US drops out, it will only happen if the accommodationists and the sovereignists come together on this one point, by the way, which has happened before. And together, they can isolate Orban and prevent the emergence of a populist alliance inside the EU. Now, that's a lot of ifs. And I have another if to add, which leads me to my fourth and final point, the role of Germany. While America has traditionally been Europe's outside guarantor, Germany has been its inside stabilizer. The country's size, its location, as well as its strong economy turned it into the one and only candidate to play such a role. Some call it Europe's indispensable power. It has played this role certainly since the Euro crisis in 2008. And it did play it relatively well for the most part. Tough on some southern European countries during the financial crisis, but mostly with a soft touch and the integrative style of Chancellor Angela Merkel until 2021. Its booming economy enabled the ascent of those Central and Eastern European countries that integrated their economies with Germany's. Germany saw itself as a peace-loving, globally engaged nation that invested in development aid and green transition. It supported European integration, America, the West at large, globalization, and what we learned to call the liberal international order. Germany had turned in the process of all of this into a status quo power after having been Europe's most assertive revisionist for the better part of a century. In fact, with unification in 1990, the German question of a country too small to dominate Europe and too big to be just one of many had been solved for the first time since industrialization. Encircled by friends. Encircled by friends was the quip of then Defense Minister Volker Rühe in the early 1990s. It was the joy of having solved the nation's biggest strategic problem and the satisfaction of being on the right side of history for the first time in 100 years that made the Germans deaf and blind against the calls by its best friends to change course and invest in hard power and the defense of a system that brought Germany peace and affluence. Instead, the country turned into Europe's biggest free rider, a status best described by the Brookings Institution scholar Constanze Stelzenmüller when she wrote, "Germany had outsourced its security to the United States, its energy needs to Russia, and its export-led growth to China." End quote. If you conceive of Germany's grand strategy as a three-legged stool consisting of these three elements that I just mentioned, the stool collapsed when Vladimir Putin attacked Ukraine in 2022. Ever since, the government is trying to fix two broken legs of the stool, energy and defense. And it is doing so at great cost. And it is trying to postpone fixing the third leg, and that is the reckoning with its China policy. In the end, the German government not least collapsed because it was unable to prioritize its strategic challenges and budget money accordingly. It was seen as a transatlantic calamity 2 weeks ago that the government crashed on the same day that Donald Trump was elected. I see it differently. A new chancellor equipped with a fresh popular mandate can start addressing the set of challenges that the country is confronted with. A neo-imperial Russia in the east, an unpredictable United States in the west, a structural economic crisis at home, and on top of that, and to begin with, a bleeding flank in Ukraine. That Germany will have a new chancellor just a few months after Donald Trump takes office allows for a fresh start. That's an opening, at least. Nothing more, nothing less. But a chancellor is not a magician. He cannot, with the snap of a finger, alter Europe's changed strategic situation, and he cannot force European unity when Donald Trump encourages disunity. So, in closing, let me end with a general observation. Today, Europe is in its most dangerous and strategically open situation since the fall of the wall in 1989. Especially in transformative moments, America has been part of the solution in Europe. With the re-election of Donald Trump, America may well have become another problem that needs to be managed, and the question is whether that problem is transitionary. And with that, I apologize for the bleak outlook, turn it back over to the chair, and wonder what the questions to this might be.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your interesting, if pessimistic, remarks. I want to start, before I open to the audience, with a question on the last topic that you raised, Germany. We have an election coming up in a couple of months. It seems, based on the poll, that the Social Democrats are likely to lose. What can we expect of a conservative green coalition if that's what ends up being the outcome of the election?
Well, if, we don't know that. I think all we know so far is that there's a likelihood that the conservative candidate will be the chancellor, but in what constellation is open, is completely open, in fact. So I think under this new leadership, the Conservative Party has developed an agenda of what they want to do. They have been very assertive in their opposition to some of the structural questions of the republic. So it would mean I don't think this is an election that will allow for continuity. So there will be some change that you will see in the German system, and given the structural problems, domestically and foreign, the first big question that this coalition will have is whether it has enough power to change course in terms of the priorities of the country as documented in the budget. That is what the previous coalition failed on. That is the first order of business that they have, and that will determine, I think, whether we will see a small or a larger shift.
Okay. And follow-up questions, what about France? I mean, historically, the German franc engine has been the motor of the European Union. You haven't talked about France. France obviously finds itself in a difficult position too, with a very debilitated economy and a president that is a lame duck. Can we expect France to play a leadership role?
Well, France has or Emmanuel Macron has immobilized himself for now, and that is part of the leadership trouble that Europe has, and the rift that is emerging between the Western Europeans and the Central and Northern Europeans, that there is really no joined, no visible French or German, much less common leadership. So any election that changes this, and it will change it on the German side more quickly than on the French side, will also give a new opportunity for a fresh start there. But there's a reason for these differences, and they don't go away, and they are at the heart a different outlook onto the strategic environment that the country haven't for the past a few years haven't been able to find common ground on.
Okay. So let's open up the floor. So please introduce yourself and your institutional affiliation, and try to keep your questions short so we have the opportunity for as many participants as possible. Carl.
I'm Carl Kaiser. I'm an associate of this center. Thomas, first of all, thank you very much for this very insightful talk. Really enjoyed it greatly. I think I have an optimistic interpretation of 2 points that you made. You mentioned the necessity for a contact group and for Europe to unite. As we speak, actually, they're now gone to bed. Today in Warsaw, there was a very interesting meeting. The foreign ministers of France, Germany, and Poland, the Weimar Triangle, Spain, Italy, and the UK, and the incoming foreign policy head, Kallas. They met in Warsaw to coordinate their policy. I draw your attention to the fact that Orban was not among them, and that Britain, not an EU member, but a European country, with a new government that wants to have a new relationship with the European Union, is in it. So this may be the beginning of a new structure to deal with Trump. So I think that's a very hopeful sign to deal with the issues that are coming up. So the contact group is emerging. Now, whether it will produce the unity that you've called for, we'll see. But at least there is the awareness. So that's a good thing.
Yes, well, I can only agree. There's, that's what this would need. You can't just wait for what Trump will throw at you. You're going to have to take. He said it loud and clear what he wants to do, and I have Helsinki is sort of my my picture in my head, Trump, Putin, and then what for Europe?
You see, this group contains both accommodationists and sovereignists. That met today in Warsaw.
Which is why I said you need the unity between those two to have a chance of overcoming inertia and division.
Alexander Sorg, I'm a postdoc fellow. So first of all, thank you, because I honestly, I thought I was losing my mind in the past year when I listened to, like, sat in many expert talks and rounds and whatnot, and it heard again and again that it's just a change in style and tone, and it really drove me crazy, and it was sort of an excuse to do nothing, right? But so I have two questions. The first one, it seems to me that an important question is what's the outlook after Trump? Because so do we think that things will return to normal? And with this, I mean, yes, there might be a pivot to Asia. The European countries will have to step up their defense spending and so on, but not like this. What you basically outlined, right? Every day could be the end of NATO kind of situation. And I'm asking this because it feels to me that a lot of these questions, or that the Trump presidency poses really difficult questions also about sovereignty, right? If you listen to J.D. Vance and he says, if you regulate Elon Musk, we won't protect you anymore. And I mean, this really goes to the heart of sovereignty, because you want to be able to do your own policies, right? So that's one. The second one, a shorter one. Who else is in the camp of the sovereignists? Is it just France? And so that would be my second question.
I mean, France has traditionally had trouble building alliances in Europe, and they would acknowledge this. But of course, the debate about European sovereignty, or as some would have it, European autonomy, that was triggered during Trump's first term, was then fueled by by Trump himself, and the question of sovereignty that you mean, and his willingness to blackmail you and connect unconnected issue areas, fueled this debate, and so therefore. I think France had a soft but oftentimes wide alliance. And it's not just countries, it's also an intellectual sphere that you will see in Brussels, very much so in the world that I work in, the think tanks. It's not just to be measured in countries, but it has an intellectual support that I think across the continent is significant. But the other question that you asked is the one that I asked myself as well, and I can not give you a good answer to it, just that I'm asking that myself. This is a second-term president. This is a president who has lots on his hand, who has a large ambition to change things domestically, and who has very little time until the midterm elections. So you might, as a strategy, to say, duck and cover, right? So let him, ask your friends in the United States to distract him, to do as many court cases as possible, as many things in the U.S. Senate. But of course, that's a short-sighted. And by the way, procrastination is something that certainly in Germany we're really good at. So we, as a strategic tool, we can do this. But your question then remains: what's next? Do we assume that there will be, as what you call, normalization, or are we seeing what is happening now is normalization? And the answer to that question is the question to your strategic outlook, I think. And I think we haven't found that question yet until and unless the domestic sources of populism are not addressed. And that is not a foreign policy question, but a question in all of our countries.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very insightful description of the situation in Europe. You quoted, Thomas, Annalena Baerbock's rather functionalist citation, Europe has to unite. And then you follow up with a description that you can see in Europe 3 different trends. The accommodationists, the sovereignists, and the populist, I would say right-wing populist, but this might be a slightly a difference. But how can you imagine that these different trends can be united? Do you expect through Trump a deepening of the cleavage between these 3 trends?
I do. That's where my pessimism comes from. However, if you want to think positively about this, is that the accommodationists and the sovereignists agree on one thing, which is strengthening European capacity. And that is what might unify them. And that is how before they have, because of course these camps are, I haven't invented them now, we could have seen them over the last years. That is how you can unify at least those around the one issue that is at stake now, and that's Ukraine. Now the question is whether it will just be Orban or whether it will be a growing number of populist. And you see the candidates on it. There's Slovakia, there's Austria, there's how is Italy going to shift if things turn in the United States, next year France. I think the number of candidates is significant, and a singular Orban, Europe has been able to isolate with costs, great costs in principle and in money. But it has been able to do so. But if your point comes to pass and that group increases, then you will have to think about coalitions of the willing, because the European systems will not be able to accommodate that type of division.
Sorry.
Oh, hi, Sherry Berman. I'm a visiting scholar here at Harvard. 2 questions. Since you're a policymaker and not just an academic, I'm going to throw them at you anyway. So the first is, after the election, we expect that there's going to be Merz as the CDU chancellor, right? But since the AfD is off the board and the FDP is too small, that leaves potentially the Greens and the SPD. In order to deal with that trilemma that you talked about and bring those parties in, something has to go. And that's likely to be the budget issue. So the first question I have is, will they give that up? Will Merz give that up in order to bring in either the SPD or the Greens? What do you think? Just a guess. And then the second question is about that trilemma. So energy, defense, and business, dependence on China. If you are advising the chancellor, which of those 3 do you prioritize, or which is most tractable? Because they strike me as all highly structural, long-term challenges and very difficult to manage together. So which would you suggest focusing on, either because you think it's the one that sort of it should be prioritized, or because you think it's the one that's the most, or the ones that are the most tractable?
Thank you for the question, because I'm not an academic. Those are the questions I like best.
Okay, good.
Can I add to that break?
Yeah,
Yes,
the debt break
that's
is
the question.
the
Yeah, the first
question, really. So the trilemma, I think I described it as a three-legged stool, right? And so that choice is no longer there. It's already, the two of them are already broken, are in the process of being fixed. I think the both of which will gain some speed. The fixing will gain more traction under the new chancellor because he's committed to further increases in defense spending, and will also have an energy policy that will then depend on the coalition. So I think the issue here is about China. And if I was to advise the German chancellor, I would ask him to postpone the China issue. And that is because you can't fix them all at once without throwing the country in a crisis that it can't manage. And therefore, much as the United States would dislike it, Germany will have a more accommodation, at least if my advice were to be heard, will have a more accommodationist policy vis-a-vis China than it would be good for Washington. My problem with that is that I couldn't and I can't discern whether the current chancellor wants to postpone or doesn't see the problems with dependency on China. Postpone I could accept for the reasons discussed. Not seeing is a bigger problem. And he hasn't given me indication that he's postponing. So, question to the next chancellor. The budget issue. Merz has already, to the chagrin of his own party, indicated that he's ready to reform the debt brake. So in whatever constellation, you will see some easing and some reform. But I think it's certainly not, it's not the only question that is necessary to ask when it comes to the budgetary needs of a combined transformation in terms of energy, in terms of defense, in terms of infrastructure, digitalization, education. These are the five big buckets. So we're going to need much more money than the debt brake will allow us to. So my suggestion would be that you ask policymakers to do three things that different constituency each don't like. You will need to raise taxes, you will have to cut spending, and that means social spending, and you have to, let's call it, reform the debt brake. Because without a broader approach to raising funds in the federal budget that will hurt all constituencies at the same time, you will not be able to raise the required funds for the magnitude of this issue. You might even say we would be transitioning from a green decade to an olive green decade.
I'm a student at the college. You addressed how Trump's approach in Ukraine would have an effect on the continent, but there's another major conflict on the world stage, Israel-Palestine. And now you have Trump coming in office, let alone his cabinet, who is known to have a much more stronger, aggressive approach, him even saying he would leave free rein to Netanyahu. And on the other hand, you have Europe, who is known to, specifically the EU, to advocate for human rights on a global stage, with even member countries like Spain recognizing a Palestinian state. How do you see them navigating this challenge in the Middle East and pushing for human rights while wishing to stay on Trump's good side for many reasons of which we discussed?
That's just one more issue where the cleavage will grow. You can see, I think, the contours of the conflict in three different ways. As an Israeli-Palestinian conflict about a two-state solution, about land in which we in the West jointly think about a two-state solution as as an outcome. You can think of this as the beginning of a long war against Iran, or you can think of this as a proxy war in a global conflict. I think the Biden administration and the Europeans were similar in that they would see it as a first of these three options. The Trump administration is trending towards the second, the beginning of a longer Iran war, and they'll be losing the Europeans on that from the get-go, I think. So that cleavage is going to open and is going to pose another sort of major management question.
So, two things. One is I agree with you on the delaying thing about China. In fact, I mean, we're talking about Germany. It's a small provincial state in the world, and so who cares? I mean, we don't need to bother about the Middle East. Others will take care of that. And with China, I think it will take care of itself as well, because the real issue is that American assets, military assets, have to be shifted from Europe to Asia. And that means that the Europeans have to replace them. And that is the financial and the defense issue. So in that sense, China takes care of itself because America will take care of China and we just will have to follow. I have another question which is related to what Jerry said. The way opinion polls are looking in Germany, it's not sure that the small grand coalition is actually big enough to form a government. If it means that then we get the CDU, the SPD, and the Greens, we have no democratic opposition anymore. What does that mean for Germany?
I mean, we have. What's a democratic opposition? We've become accustomed to calling the center, the four center parties, the democratic parties, thus excluding the populist right and the populist left, giving them or denying them this term. But not everybody is Mr. Höcke in Thuringia and a straightforward neo-Nazi. So I think we will have to get acquainted to the fact that there is all kinds of unruly, unhappy, and untraditional opposition in the parliament that you cannot just want to exclude. We're having 20 to 30% of the people in some swath of the country. This weekend there was a parliamentarian from Bavaria who told me that in his district the traffic light, the governing traffic light coalition is at less than 10%. So I think we need to, and that's Bavaria, that's not Saxony. So I think we have to get used to the fact that our electoral map looks differently and that opposition will look differently.
Which means we follow France.
In what respect?
Extreme left, extreme right, and no capacity to govern after some delays.
But there is no extreme left.
One thing.
Very weak one.
Right.
Correct. Yeah.
Sure. The bit is a bit of a domestic debate that I don't want to get too deep into. To not, not everybody will be interested in the ins and outs of the party system there.
It's a dilemma in many other countries. It's not just a German one. So.
Indeed, it is. We're a latecomer in this.
Yeah. So. Yes.
Well, maybe to take it back to the question of the new president and the old continent, some of the more specific questions. So, coming back to the J.D. Vance statement that if the Commission regulates X and his other enterprises, then that the US should basically revoke Article 5 of the NATO Treaty or something like that. So, I mean, that's very blunt and probably will not happen quite like that, but it kind of signals a willingness, I guess, to leverage security commitments for gain in other areas. And I think that's generally in line with Trump's transactionist kind of understanding, even the way he seems to understand how NATO works and funding works, even though it doesn't work quite that way. But for him, I think it's an exchange of protection against kind of payments. It's at least how he frames it in public. And so I'm wondering how much of that we will see, and whether you think that might actually, I mean, it will be harmful either way, but whether you think it works, whether Europe can be arm wrestled into like concessions in other areas through the threat of withdrawing security guarantees.
Yes, it can, for some time. But two things will happen. I mean, Europe has the problem of having this, call it bullying approach from the West and a clear and present military danger from the East. And at the time of a security dependence, people are going to want to eat this up. But they will eat it up only for so long. This will create two things. It will improve the willingness to invest in independence and sovereignty, and it will be jet fuel to those who want this in a drastic version. So if I was, if I had the chance to talk to J.D. Vance, I said, careful how often you do this. Yes, you can, but for how long? Doesn't seem satisfactory. You look at me.
I mean, on the one hand, you have the more rationalist kind of theories of coercion, and so you see it's really difficult to leverage security guarantees because it's also uncredible in a way, but only for a rational actor. So I'm really unsure I think it's two separate questions. Will they try and what will the consequences be, right? But I'm concerned. I think it will happen and it will be very, very harmful for strategic stability and so on.
Exactly.
Yes. Nowadays, we are talking about the meeting that is going to happen between the ministers of foreign affairs of Poland, Germany, France, including Italy, and also Spain wanted to be invited. The kind of enlarged Weimar Triangle. I was wondering whether we should not also include other states in European Union so that they are not excluded from the talks about the future of security in Europe vis-a-vis what is called happening in the East. For example, Sweden, with their military capabilities, and other countries. Why there is always has to be a group of just few, taking the leading role. Previously, that was France and Germany, but they are kind of weak at the moment due to political situation in their countries. So that's why there was the movement in Poland to invite Italians and also at the last stage Spanish. What would you think about enlarged coalition of political leaders talking about the future and joining forces together, knowing that in some way Europe is going to have to defend itself, maybe, if things will unfold not in the right way?
There was a sentence by Obama that I remember, that people always want the smallest possible group at the table that includes themselves. And that, I think, is a common understanding in Europe, that is the case. We all want small, that includes us. So these are practical reasons. You need a manageable small group, whether that's 3 or 4 or 5 countries. This is already a big group that seems to have assembled in Warsaw. One would actually hope that it becomes smaller, not larger, for practical purposes. We have to trust each other in Europe. We've been able to do that in the Quad. We've been doing it in the JCPOA. We should be able to do it in in terms with Ukraine, but what should be represented is that sort of philosophies and the thinking, also geographic thinking, should be represented. You can't replace the threat that is created through geography, so you need some Eastern Europeans there, and you can't exclude the Southern Europeans. So I think there's a way you do this, but keep it tight.
One question about Ukraine, Thomas. How much leverage does Europe have to settle the conflict? And what happens if the US, if Trump comes up with an agreement with Russia that Europe is not willing to live with?
I think that Europe has little leverage. That's the whole point it were to have leverage if it were willing to give a combination of security guarantees and replacing America. That is, in a moment of war, only hard power creates leverage. Mm-hmm. If you don't do that, your leverage will be much smaller. And I see it as perfectly possible that Donald Trump will ignore all this, ignore all the no contact groups, and move ahead with his partner Vladimir Putin. So, and what would Europe do at this point? They would find ways to manage the problem as long as they can't produce an alternative outcome and create the leverage to do so.
And if that comes to pass, what will it mean for the European Union?
Oh, it will have a very destructive result on the European Union, because the change of perspective of the United States vis-a-vis the European Union will increase centrifugal forces in the European Union. We tend to forget that it was the combination of NATO and the European Union that is the construct that keeps Europe together. If you have a United States interested in division, these divisions will also be visible in Europe. And if a question of war and peace in Ukraine is the lever, those divisions will be even larger.
So if I take this up and you imagine for a moment that Trump does a deal with Putin on Ukraine, do you expect that the Ukraine will still be able to join the European Union?
The European Union, the membership in the European Union will only be possible if there is some version of security. Because without security, you will not have investment, foreign direct investment. You will probably have some version of a frozen conflict or some version of a stagnant economy. It's very hard to conceive that that Ukraine will even be able to meet the conditions under which you would be able to include it in the European Union. So I think these things are linked, we've seen Turkey have a candidacy status for 40 years. So I don't see them. This fast track entry in the European Union is then very unlikely.
Carl, final question.
Could I add a point on the possible European leverage on the US? I think there is one, namely that a Russian gain in Ukraine helps China, and that is something Trump cares about. So that in the great geopolitical battle that is relevant for Trump, if that formula changes, it doesn't help him. And I think the Europeans have to use all ways and means to clarify to him, do you really want Russia to gain so that China has a stronger partner in the great battle between the West and the authoritarians. So,
Under my thing, you would have to exclude Germany from that because Germany they will not be able to win this type of confrontation at this time, given its other challenges with Russia and energy. But in general, your point is well taken, of course.
We are at time, so I want to thank Thomas for his remarks and interesting comments. Thank you.